Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Welcome to the School for Change Agents 2018. And can you believe it? We are on module 4 of 5 already. We have hundreds of people joining us now. So we really have a great community going. And happy International Women's Day to all the women and men who are joining us and celebrating with us today. If you're just joining, please do use the chat box to let us know who you are, where you're coming from, to share your Twitter handle if you want to. I'm just going to do a few more shout outs and then we'll get started. So hello to everyone joining from South Warwickshire NHS Trust. You are very welcome. James in Bristol, who's keeping his head down in an open office. Very sensible, James. Hello to Paul, Emma, Jane, all joining from Sandwell and Dudley, a fantastic part of the Midlands in England. David joining us in London. We've got Damilola joining from Canada. You're very welcome from across the pond. We've got people joining us from Glensford, which is New York, I think. You're also very welcome. Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, British Columbia. We've got a Change Foundation group joining. Hello, you're very welcome to school. And the New York State Department of Health Division of Operations and Systems. My goodness, that's a mouthful. Well, welcome everybody to the School for Change Agents. Here are some things that you can do as we start the session. You can shut your door. Make sure your mobile is on silent. Hang up a sign to ask people not to disturb you and maybe also to tell them what you're up to. Close down your emails. And if you want to, just take a moment to write on a piece of paper, what do you want to get from today's session? And if you're feeling particularly brave, share that photo with us on social media and we promise to tweet you back. So hello. My name is Catherine Pereira. I am delighted to be leading today's session where we are going to be joining the threads that have been running through the first 3 weeks and looking at how we move from me as an individual to how we move to us as a group, the collective, and how we inspire people to act by the way that we use emotions as a resource so that change becomes as much about why we do what we do as it is about the head, what it is that we do. Before we get started, I want to introduce to you our fantastic team. We have, as ever, a homegrown team within Horizons, so I'll be presenting. We have Paul, who'll be leading on the technical support along with Ollie. We have Lee and Lynette today doing the monitoring on Twitter, so please do get into conversation with them there. And then we have Ian, who's joining us as a chat monitor backed by popular demand, with Helen Bevan, the one and only. And Helen told me that this is the first time that she will have been a chat monitor on school. So I hope that you'll use the chat box, make her feel welcome, and also make good use of having both Helen and Ian there to share ideas and start conversations with you as we go through the module today. So joining in the conversation, this is really important. School is not about a broadcast, it's about energy and ideas. So we hope that you'll join us in conversation by social media and also in the chat. Now, if you're replying to people in the chat box, it would really help the thread of the conversation if you could use @ and then their name. So if I was replying to Emma, I would say @Emma, and then post a comment. Often we get maybe 10,000 points of chat in the box through the course of the hour. So it really helps to piece together the conversation. The other thing that will help is if you can select everyone from the drop-down menu. So if you go to your chat box, you'll see at the bottom of the screen an option as to who you want to post the chat to. You can post it to an individual, or you can select everyone, and that makes sure that all of the panelists and all of the participants see your comments. So please do make sure that that's selected when you go through. So on to this week's module. We're going to start with a quick recap of what we've done before, because as I say, we're going to pull the threads together. So in the previous 3 modules, we've looked at a big paradigm that sits right across the way that we teach how you make change happen. And that's the frame of structure and agency. And we're going to come back to that today. We've looked at how we build agency and some design principles, actionable, connected, and extensible, for how we spread the change we want to make. And then last week, we looked at a new way of thinking about resistance, and Helen took us through a module on reactants. And I then led the piece in how that links to resilience and what American researchers are calling grit. How do we build constancy of purpose to stick with it for the long term? So what we're going to do this week is take those principles and push them into the collective. We're going to look at what it means to have a social movement approach in healthcare. We're going to look at stories as a resource, something that I have that I can use in order to move others. We're going to frame that within what Marshall Gantz calls the craft of public narrative. And what I'm looking to do here is to ensure that we have some really practical tools. So whatever you're working on in change, you can take those away and apply them in your work. Then we'll look at some frameworks for activism. And finally, some very practical tips for how you get started in using a movement approach in your work in public service. So, Paul, I'm going to hand the ball over to you now, because we're going to start with a quick poll and 2 questions about your experience. So Paul is going to set up a poll for us, but if you're unable to use the poll, you can always post your answers in the chat box. So the 2 questions are going to be this. In my team, do you consciously use stories to inspire and energize each other and those around you? And in your team, do you invest as much time and care in developing your people as you do in delivering your outputs? So, Paul, can I ask you just to talk people through the poll and get us started, please?
Okay, thank you, Catherine, and welcome to everybody joining today. I'm just opening the poll up now, which you should see appearing in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So I can see the early adopters have started to do it already. So about a third of the group, half of the group of in progress now, Catherine. So.
Great. Lovely. So if you're joining us through the chat box, for these 2 statements, perhaps you could just give us an idea of whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree, or something in between, agree or disagree or not sure. And we're just going to get a feel for right across the cohort. We've got several hundred people with us at the moment, for where we think the balance is. How are we doing, Paul?
It's just gone up to the last 10 seconds for people to be able to complete it. And we've got about 240 responses so far. So
good.
If we leave it last few seconds, the poll will naturally close down then. And then as soon as the results are available, I'll pop them up on screen for you.
Lovely. So what I'm trying to do to start us off is to put our minds into a space where we're thinking about stories as something that we consciously apply, and to put us into a space that in community organising we refer to as a distributed leadership or developmental space, which is the idea that we'll come back to through this module, that developing our people as leaders, as people who are able to create change with others, is as important as delivering the end product. And indeed, community organising theory would hold that in developing our people, we will achieve and deliver much more of the end product as a result. So it's borrowing on those ideas, which we're going to explore later in the work of Marshall Gantz. And I think we have some results. And Paul, will other people be able to see these too?
Yes, I've shared them. So everyone in the session should be able to see and share the results.
It's interesting because the main category in the first question, do we consciously use stories to inspire and energize each other? A lot of people agreeing that they do, which is actually, I find very hopeful and encouraging, because often the conscious use of stories is less pronounced. And then again, interesting in whether we invest as much time and care in developing our people as we do in delivering our outputs. There's an interesting spread, but kind of an equal number of people agreeing and disagreeing there, and a number of people strongly disagreeing. So saying that the emphasis on delivering outputs is invested in far more than the time and care in developing our people. So I'm going to look at those in more detail after this, and probably write a little blog about what I think it could be showing. Perhaps you can help me by sharing your reactions and feedback in the chat box. Thanks for that. So I'm going to move us straight into the module. And what I want to do is tackle head on this question of what do we mean by a movement approach? So I love this quote from Sue Tibbles. She said, you know, the thing to remember when we're thinking about pursuing social change is that it's much more of an art than a science. You know, there's no fixed model, no curricula, no rules, no guarantees. It's about reading power, building relationships, framing issues, honing messages, mobilizing supporters and bringing pressure to bear. And rather pessimistically, she says, you know, all of this is happening in an increasingly complex network society in which assumptions that we held even a year ago no longer hold. So there's a few things I think from that. The first is we're talking about doing something here that is really challenging. It's challenging because of the external context, where what we understand of the world is constantly changing, where, as we explored before, there's a strong impetus in the last generation of public service towards an old power or a hierarchical or a structured way of looking at the world. But it's also because when it comes to using movement approaches, so approaches that mobilize others and develop others in a conscious way, there is no science behind the way that we do it. It's not to say that it's not evidence-based, but it's much more in the space of intuition, of using relational skills, of understanding the craft of how we build public relationships than it is about following a fixed model. And what we're going to explore today is very much in that space. We're going to take 2 or 3 big themes and look at what is the method for me to explore this for myself and how could I integrate it into my work. Before we do that, I want to just say a little bit about me so that you know who it is who is leading you through this story over the next 50 minutes. I'm not a long-term NHS professional yet. I've only been in the NHS for 18 months. And before I joined the NHS, I practiced law. So I worked as a barrister. I had the wig and gown situation going on. But even 3 years into practicing law, I became very disillusioned with it. I practiced equal pay law, but I realised that I was much more interested in why we had unequal pay than I was in litigating problems. This is the only photo that I could find of myself in my wig, which probably tells you something about my attitude to pomp and ceremony. I always had an equivocal relationship with being at the bar. I want to tell you about 2010. Which was a year in which 2 extraordinary things happened to me. I decided that I was going to leave the bar and try and find a new way. So I was at a point in my life where I was leaving behind one world and looking at what the world might be. And I was on holiday abroad when I got a phone call to my hotel room, which, is an unusual thing. It was my dad. He said 3 short sentences. He said, "Come home, it's your mum, she has cancer." So I went home, arrived home late that night, and I met with my mum, my dad, my brothers, and the 5 of us got to talking. The situation wasn't good. My mum's prognosis was bad. She had been offered palliative care, and she was going with my dad to meet the surgeon the following day to talk through whether there were any other options. And over the course of the 5 of us talking, we realised that we wanted to meet the surgeon, all 5 of us together, and talk to him about what could be done. And that's what we did. And I will never forget his face when he walked into the tiny, cold room where he was to meet with my mum and was confronted by 5 people staring at him intently, keen to engage in a conversation. I think he literally did a backward take nearly out of the room. So we're sitting in that room and the surgeon tells us that it's risky. There is an operation he can perform, but there's no guarantee of success. And there's a real prospect that mum will die in the course of the operation. And we talked for an hour. And what I realized during the conversation is that the surgeon is trying to get the courage to act. And he's asking us about our relationships. He's asking us about who's there to care for mum. He's asking her about what she does in her spare time. And the more we talk, the more I realise that his technical expertise is only one piece of what might save my mum. And the other piece is the network of relationships around her, that other form of power that will see her through not just an operation, but the recovery and the relapse and the possible re-recovery and the chemotherapy that we know may follow. And I learned a lot in that room today, because at the end, the surgeon looked at my mum and he had these piercing blue eyes and he said, "Do you trust me to do this operation?" And she said to him, "I will trust you if you trust us." And they went for it and they did the operation. And, I took that learning into something else that I did that year that was extraordinary. Because I was back in my hometown looking after my parents, I decided to do something I'd wanted to do for a long time. So I stood for elected office. I stood in the general election to become a member of parliament. For those of you joining from across the pond, that means that I stood for the equivalent of a senatorial seat. But while that may sound very grand, I had £93 for my general election campaign. And I had a small but merry band of travellers. And so we did everything through relationship because we had no other resource. We talked to people about growing up in the town and what it had meant to us. We asked people to bring friends, bring whatever resource they could to help us form a campaign. And despite how it might look in this photo, I didn't win. But the next year, we took our first 2 council seats in a generation. So I learned the whole time how relationship is key to being able to build the ability to act. And my mum, to finish the story, survived her operation, survived infections, survived chemotherapy. She is thriving today, and she has met 5 grandchildren since then, whom she would never have known if we had taken no for an answer in that room. Great academics write about this question of relationship. I want to introduce you to the work of a woman called Hari Hahn, for starters. Hari writes about how we become transformed, not alone, but when we're in relationship with others. And it is that mutual commitment, the reciprocity that comes through relationship, which is really at the root of a movement approach. For me, this really matters because these questions are hundreds of years old, and they've been used in shaping the way that we think about public service and democracy. The great writer Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about how knowing how to combine, the knowledge of how to combine, is the mother of all other forms of knowledge, and on its progress depends that of all others. And he said he observed that looking at the new United States in the late 18th century and seeing how the ability of small groups of people to find common cause was the basis of the democracy that was going to thrive for the next 300 years. And, Helen talked in Module 1 and Module 2 about the dominance of structure in healthcare and how recently that is becoming balanced by this idea of agency. And it's that balance which is filtering through into the way that we think about big programs of works. So there's been a big drive in recent years to bring social movement thinking and practice into delivery, whether it's through Nesta's work or individual health modules, or the work that we do where we get asked about it more and more. And I want to just put that shift in context. Why is it that people are more interested in this approach now than they have been previously? I think one part is what we explored through Module 2, which is when you have levers and you pull them and you don't get an effect, and you pull them harder and you don't get an effect. You have to start to look at different ways of making change. And, if we know one thing about effective boat rockers, is that they tend to do things through motivation rather than compulsion. In other words, they use what they can of that hierarchical approach, but they marry it with an understanding of not why don't people join in, but why would they? What is it that moves other people to action, and how can we move them with us? And it really comes back to this idea, I think, of two frames for thinking about power, our ability to act. Okay, so we've looked at an old power frame, which is about positional power that's held by few, pushed down and commanded. But what we see in a movement approach is much more emphasis on a new power approach. Power as an energy, a current, something that's owned by many, something that is radically open and transparent and is built on relationship. So, Paul, I'm going to ask you to play a short animation at this point as a way of illustrating the different mindsets that we're referring to here. So this comes courtesy of a 16-year-old student in the States called Havana Lehman. So Havana, thank you very much for the graphics. So who can tell me what this is? Maybe you want to put that in the chat box. Familiar, right? So this is Tetris, and this was the #1 game of the 1990s. Yes, Tetris, everybody's saying. Things literally drop down onto your head, and your job is to make everything fit into neat lines. And it gets faster and faster and faster until eventually you break down, right? Contrast that with this. What have we got? Go on, tell us in the chat box. Minecraft, right? So now this is the second biggest game of all time, and it's interesting that it is, it's a block-based game, but it works very differently from Tetris. So Minecraft starts with a green field, and there's literally nothing there, and the users collaborate to build it. They build it piece by piece, block by block, and everything that happens in Minecraft is collaborative, right? So I think, for me, there's an increasingly explicit tension in the world between those who have been raised in a tradition of Tetris and those who are coming with a new Minecraft mindset. And when we think about movements and we think about public narrative, what we're really thinking about is how do we harness the energy of Minecraft approaches in order to transform health and care. So I want to introduce you to an extraordinary man called Marshall Gantz, who is working at the moment out of Harvard, but from the 1950s onwards worked as a civil rights activist and then a community organizer with agrarian communities in California in the west of the United States. Marshall writes about stories, what he calls public narratives, narratives that we share in public as a resource to move others to action. And he talks about them as the root of all work that enables movement to happen. And he says this, the thing we have to understand about stories is that they don't just teach us how to act, they inspire us to act. Stories communicate our value through the language of the heart, the emotions, and it is what we feel, whether it's our hopes, our cares, our obligations, and not simply what we know, that can inspire us to act and can inspire us with courage. So what I think Marshall is drawing out there is the distinction between the head and the heart, which is another way of looking at kind of an old new power or structure agency frame, okay? The head and the heart. And what he's suggesting is that stories are the means by which we teach the heart so that we can guide the heart in how to act in future, regardless of the specifics, okay? So this is critical to mindful action for change because the world is inherently uncertain. Whenever we call on somebody to act with us, we are inviting the possibility of failure. And so it is really accessing the courage to take the first movement, which is key. Here's another way of sort of portraying the same thing. There's what we do, our head, our analysis, our strategy. And that piece is critical to any meaningful action. But too often we don't balance it with the second question, why we do what we do. And that's a question to the heart, which relies on narrative. And through narrative, we create movement. I often think of this in the way that we talk about films. This film moved me. This book moved me. In other words, the root of the word emotion is motion, movement. And if we can connect with emotion as a resource, then we're able to move other people to action. So what I would like to do at this point is share with you two very simple frames that you might choose to use on your own and with colleagues to start to explore your stories and how you use them with intention. So the first frame I'm going to show you comes from the work of Marshall Gantz, and it's the challenge, choice, outcome frame. And thank you again to Lee Kendall for another beautiful sketch note to illustrate the point. The idea is basically this. Every story has three central components. It has a plot, a protagonist, and a moral. Okay, but what is it? What makes a plot a plot? Okay, what is it that captures our interest? What captures our interest in a story is tension, a moment of unknown, the unexpected. Okay, so in this case, the boat rocker, let's carry on our theme, sets out on a journey, but she or he faces a challenge and has to make a choice. And it is that point of choice which is so critical. Will the surgeon perform the operation or not? Will I have the courage to act and stand for Parliament, or will I not? How will we react in a given circumstance? And it is in that choice and the outcome of it that we get the lesson. So stories provide a guide in this way. And it's a way of us thinking about stories that we want to share with others. So I want you to take a moment and think about a change project that you're involved with, or one that you would like to start, and to think, how do I explain why this matters to me? How do I explain what the challenge is that I'm calling on people to face with me? And what do I think the choice is? If we act, then this happens. And if we don't act, then nothing happens. How am I explaining that choice? And this very simple frame of challenge, choice, outcome is the bedrock of creating public narratives. So the second one I want to share with you with an equally beautiful graphic is the frame of self, us, now. So this is an idea that every story which has a public narrative call to action, as opposed to a story which exists in and of itself, not only talks about the individual, the self, it also talks about a wider us, and it asks for our commitment before we act. So every story that forms the basis of a movement has these three elements. It's an element of self. Who am I? What makes me tick? How do I give an account of myself in the world? There's an element of us, calling to other people to come with us and giving us a reason why we would want to act together. And there's an element of now. In other words, an explanation as to why there is something at risk or some opportunity of hope that we have to seize in the moment now. So I'm going to break those 3 points down, and then I'm going to pause, and I'm putting our chat monitors on note. I'm going to come to you and see what's been happening in the chat room. So the first element, the self. I do not think you can really deal with change without a person asking real questions about who they are and how they belong in the world. So this is a question about my own narrative and the account that I give. And I use the word account advisedly, because the basis of this theory is, if I am going to presume to lead, in other words, to invite other people to act with me, then I better be pretty sure that I can explain who I am, why I care, and why they should take the risk of acting with me. Okay? So it's about thinking consciously about these questions. What are the moments in time, the things that have happened to me, the feelings that I've had, the choices that I've made that communicate to the world what makes me tick? Okay? And how do they relate to this thing that I want to achieve, this change? In other words, it's drawing a thread between the change as an object and my own motivation as a way of enabling people to be motivated along with me. Okay? So that's the element of a story of self. A story of us is about creating what I would call an expansive we. Okay, recognizing that what we want to do is to bring other people into action. So, what is it about my individual story that links to others? I might take the story of my mum and say, who amongst us has not experienced a moment where relationships were key to us achieving something great? And who amongst us doesn't know what it feels like to be fearful of losing what we love most? Those are the we moments, the us moments, the general ideas that others can join with us in and shape. And, the other element to we is this question of acting with, thinking creatively about our people. We think of this in Horizons as trying to always have a spectrum of allies, not just the usual suspects who we know would be amenable to our story, but also thinking about, who are the people who seem to be in opposition now? Who are the people who I want to bring with me? Who can I pull with my stories from being neutral into understanding that we share a cause, that we share an interest? And it's analysing that spectrum of people that allows us to create movement with others. And then the final one of the three, a story of now. Martin Luther King talked about the fierce urgency of now, and he talked about it as a construct. So it is not an idea that, at some point it's going to be the right time for change. The fierce urgency of now is about creating a moment where we can explain why, if we do not act now, things will get worse, or why, if we don't seize this opportunity, then we will miss the chance of a lifetime. And that is the urgency. And when we put those three things together, we craft a story, a narrative of ourselves and of us and of what we need to do now. And that's the basis of a social movement approach. So I'm going to pause there, and I've got an example for you that I want to share in a moment, but I'm really keen to hear from Helen and Ian first about what's been happening in the chat room.
Hi, Catherine. Oh, wow. The chat room is just a fantastic place to be for the last sort of half an hour or so. We've got into some really beautiful debate about stories and about how they help us connect, how they help us relate to each other, and how they help us remember the things that are important to us. A good debate also ensued about data vis-a-vis stories, and actually I think the conclusion the chat room came to is that both are important in terms of supporting each other. And finally, lots of love to yourself, Catherine, in the chat room in terms of your own personal story, and people saying how touched they were about that. So it's been fantastic so far. Looking forward to more of it.
Lovely. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everyone. And Helen, hello.
Hello, Catherine, and hello, everybody. And I'm really enjoying myself in the chat box. So 2 points I wanted to make. So the first one is to carry on from where Ian left off, because things were very active in the chat box, and then when you started to tell your story, Catherine, it got very quiet. And I think it was a real example of how people were getting so drawn into your story, they didn't want to write in the chat box, they just wanted to listen to you. And Sonali summed this up. She said, I listened more intently when you started your story and paused in the chat box. And Sonali, you weren't the only one. It was much easier being a chat room monitor when Catherine was storytelling. And the other quick point I wanted to make was a very interesting debate going on in the chat room around situations where people find it uncomfortable telling their stories. Yeah. And thinking about what's actually going on here. Is this about me and my personality? Like, is it because I'm a shy introvert and I don't like sharing? or is it to do with the environment in which I find myself? And what was interesting was that there were a whole series of people giving lovely examples in the chat box of where actually it's about the environment and how do we make storytelling normal. So Kristin from Sweden was talking about how her team has introduced a situation where the whole team introduces themselves with a brief story. Becky Haynes was talking about how her team always start with a patient story and team members share personal and family stories. So sometimes it feels awkward, I think, telling stories because it's not normal. It's not what we normally do in our environment. But I think there's some fabulous examples in the chat box around how people are making it normal. And I say bring it on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. I just want to refer to one of those. It puts me in mind of something that Marshall once said to me, which is Marshall Gantz said. He said that unless we begin to act, we cannot begin to learn what it is we need to know to act effectively. And he was referring to the story of now. But I think the same thing applies to that question of, where do I start with stories? I guess we start by telling them. It's that old Chinese proverb I referred to a couple of weeks ago in the chat box that, the way to there isn't a way to compassion. Compassion is the way. And it's the same thing with stories. It can feel very frightening, but it's also something that we learn through practice. And unless we begin to practice, we cannot learn how we can tell them in an effective way to move others. So let me just come across to Lee and Lynette and hear what's been happening on social media.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. It's wow, you've been keeping us so busy over on Twitter. It's brilliant. And very similar to over in the chat room, people loved your story, Catherine. So thank you very much for sharing that. People were very moved by your generosity and sharing that very personal story. And very similarly to what Helen was saying about stories, there is a lovely tweet by Sean who said, about how other industries have harnessed the power of storytelling and even employed a chief storytelling officer. And such incredible examples of leveraging narrative to drive social movement is something to consider for healthcare, which sounds brilliant because, of course, it links to the health and the heart. And somebody else has made a connection about the head and the heart, and leading and dealing with change. We need a balance of both. And loving the comment about emotion and emotion.
Lovely, thank you. And Lynette, did you want to add anything? Hi, Lynette, are you there?
I think Lynette's having a couple of technical problems.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm gonna not great that she's got technical problems, but I will lead us on in that case. Lee, thanks very much. So what I want to do is to make this real, because it's one thing talking about the concepts, but I want to introduce you to somebody who can give us a real example of how this worked. And many of you in the UK and elsewhere may know of this, but I'm not going to assume that everyone does when I introduce the Hello, My Name Is campaign. Okay. So let me tell you the story of the woman who founded this campaign with her husband, Chris. Her name was Kate Granger. She was a young woman about the same age as me, a couple of months older, in fact. And in 2011, she was working as a junior doctor. And she was on holiday with her husband, Chris, when she was taken very seriously ill. And she was then diagnosed with what was a rare and aggressive form of sarcoma, a cancer. Kate received treatment for her cancer and experienced a period of relatively good health. But when her condition began to deteriorate again, she was taken into hospital for an MRI scan to see what was wrong. And she later wrote about her experience of being in the hospital. She wrote that nobody said hello to her or introduced themselves by name. And she wrote about one incident that she said, quote, left her psychologically scarred. She said that she was in a hospital room on her own. She was cold and alone. She was 29 years old and she knew she had cancer, but she thought it was confined to her abdomen. A junior doctor came in to talk to her about the MRI scan results, and without introducing himself or asking if she wanted anybody else with her, he said, "I'm afraid your cancer has spread." Kate used that experience to talk to her husband, Chris, and to, as he later put it, moan about how poor the treatment had been and the way in which it made her feel that nobody had introduced themselves properly. And having talked it over, they decided that they wanted to do something about it. So Kate sent this tweet. It said, "I'm going to start a Hello, My Name Is campaign. I've sent Chris home to design the logo." And then she put the hashtag Hello, My Name Is. What happened after that was explosive. Hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of people retweeted, got in touch, started to become involved in the campaign to help Kate and Chris shape it. They had friends who gave them resources like a logo and a website. And they started to just talk to people about this very simple idea, which is that if we introduce ourselves with our name, we create a humanity, a common bond, which is important not just for the dignity of the patient, but also for establishing the human connection, which is the basis of good care. This idea caught on. People around the world started pledging. There were Hello, My Name badges. There were seminars given. Kate spoke at international conferences. And Chris even did a TEDx talk in the end to explain the genesis of the story. Celebrities decided to become involved as well. And in 2016, on her 11th wedding anniversary, Kate Granger died. But she didn't die before she'd achieved these remarkable things. More than 1.6 billion interactions on Twitter, a campaign that's widely used across healthcare today. She had reframed the start of the therapeutic relationship for thousands of people working in the NHS. There are dozens of global ambassadors that carry on her work today. And by the time of her death, Kate and her husband had raised more than £250,000 for charity. And I believe that the day of Kate's wedding anniversary, which 11 years later was the day of her death in July each year, will now be known as the Hello, My Name Is Day in the NHS. So, an extraordinary story about a remarkable woman. Well, what I want to do is to apply our two frames of movement analysis and see how those worked. So the first one is this: challenge, choice, outcome. This is Chris, Kate's husband. And when he talked about their experience together, he said this. He said the evening after she'd been treated badly in the MRI results scan conversation, she said that evening, Kate and I were talking about it, and Kate was moaning. There's no other way of saying it. She was moaning about it. And I said, look, Kate, if you've got something that's not right, either stop moaning or do something about it. And he said, we decided to do something about it. So, if you analyze that through challenge and choice, there's a really clear linchpin to this story. There's the choice of the junior doctor in how he introduces himself. But bigger than that, there's the choice of Kate that she took in how she responded to those circumstances. And it is the outcome of that choice that she didn't just moan, but she did something very small at the time to send a tweet. She did something as a result, and then she kept pushing into that space. It tells us so much about Kate. But the point I really want us to grasp from this is that it tells us a great deal also about Chris. When we think about leadership in an old power sense, we often think about people in positions of authority. But having worked in campaigning and organising for nearly a decade now, the people most critical to change, the people I most admire, are what I call the first followers. Okay? There is no movement without a first follower. Without that person who reaches out to the leader, gives them the courage to act, pushes them, holds them to account, there is no movement. And when we come to follow, very rarely do we simply follow a leader. Most of us follow that first follower. Okay, so without them, there's nothing that's happening. Okay, so first followers are what transform a lone actor into a leader. And if nothing else from this, I think we should look at how we celebrate that first follower and reflect to ourselves on where's my first follower coming from if I have a clear sense of change? Or who do I see who's a lone actor and needs a first follower? And is that the critical leadership role that I can exercise? So let's look through our second frame, which is the frame of self, us, now. And I promise you that once you've seen this frame, you will spot it everywhere. Kate spoke to a group of 1,000 students about her experiences, and this is about 2 years before she died. And she said this, look, if you put yourself in my position, this is what happened. I was told I had cancer. I thought it was restricted. The junior doctor came to see me. He came into my room, he sat down, and without warning, he said, your cancer has spread. She switches into exploring the simple idea of what that means for an expansive us. She says, look, it's very simple. It's something we all can do. Patients are people, and we should treat everyone like we would treat a member of our own family. A very simple us. And then at the end of speaking to these students, she constructed the now. She said, if we get the simple things right for students, that's going to bode well for the future of healthcare. So she called us to act in a very simple way. And what I've done in the slides is to include a couple of further examples for you. So there's one classic Barack Obama using the Self, Us, Now frame to call us to action in 2004. This was the first time that Barack had appeared on a national stage, and he talked about his self, his own family background. But he's connected it to the American dream. You know, this idea he had that nowhere else on earth would his story even be possible. And he called on us now to act. This year, in this election, you have a choice, and the outcome of that choice will tell the world what America stands for. So as a rhetorical device in how we move people to action, the Self, Us and Now framework lies at the root of so much movement theory. And I've included here some resources. There's some free resources that are available online. There's also a number of courses that if you're interested in these ideas after school, you can go forward and take and learn a bit more about how it works. So in the final part of today's module, I want to just bring together some of the strands around what it means to be an activist. And I'm going to return to the work of Hari Hahn to do that. So Hari is a political scientist, a professor operating in the United States. And she started studying the Obama 2008 campaign and then 2012. And she's been writing for about 15 years now on how organizations can develop activists. Hari uses three frames for thinking about activism. She talks about lone wolves, which is her phrase, and she uses that to mean people who are acting individually. She talks about mobilizers and she talks about organizers. So I'm going to talk through the differences between these three. And while I'm doing it, I want you to have this question in mind. You know, which kind of activists do you think are the most successful at creating agency and delivering results? Okay, so that's the question that we're going to hold in our minds. So let me come to lone wolves first. So these are people who build power by expertise and information. Okay, so traditional forms of advocacy, oversight, contributing to committees, public comments, and other forms of consultation. So their focus is primarily on imparting information and expertise, and is less on how they build power through relationship with other people. And I think in a healthcare space, we see, you know, kind of lone wolves operating at various parts of the structure. I want to put one interesting idea to you, which is that the way that the structure piece works can have a tendency to encourage lone wolf behaviour. And this is an idea that we've been exploring with patient activists and experts by experience. There's a wonderful quote by an expert by experience, Annette McKinnon, talking about patient leaders as lone wolves. And, you know, Annette said this, she said, you know, what I'm ranting about is the way in which patients are being streamed into advisory subcommittees, the way we're being used as tokens to help tick off the right boxes. Where is the attitude that patients are part of a team in healthcare, that we're your partners? Why are we always asked to participate inside a predetermined frame, not determined by patients, right? When will we see co-design of new policies and ultimately co-production? And I think in our experience of the NHS, we do see these things coming through and spaces being created for a more agentic way of doing things. But time and again, we also see the way in which structure might lean people towards kind of lone wolf behaviours rather than providing a space for mobilising and organising. So mobilisers, the second of Hari Han's frames. These are people who build power by mobilizing others. So they create moments in time, kind of apexes of action, where we can take a specified action together to make a change. And the way I would distinguish mobilizing from organizing is in their first question. A mobilizer's first question is, what is my issue? What is it that I'm trying to change? And I would contrast that with an organizer's first question, which is, who are my people? And what is it that they want to change? Okay, so organizing is built on this idea of developing leadership, our ability to act together. And that if we identify and recruit and train a distributed network of leadership, we create something that can win many battles rather than focusing solely on one issue. And so that would be the root of the tension between mobilizing and organizing. So go on then, let's see, chat room, what do we think? Do we think the most effective and most successful activists at creating agency and delivering results are lone wolves, mobilizers, organizers? Helen, Ian, tell us what we're seeing in the chat.
Okay, so I'll go first. We got an awful lot of chat, first of all, around the Hello, My Name Is campaign. And Roxanne, I think in particular, gave us a really nice quote in terms of that campaign. Too often we forget that empathy is a form of treatment, she said. I think that went a long way. We're just getting into the debate now about lone wolves as well, which is proving a little bit contentious. Some people saying that, Lorraine is advocating that once the lone wolves become a pack, they will become unstoppable. And we're having a debate at the moment as to whether or not it's a good thing occasionally to be a lone wolf. So that's coming through at the moment, Catherine.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm seeing in the chat room comments about all three being valuable. And I think that has to be right, that there are different ways of driving change depending on the problem we're trying to tackle. What the research found, which makes this a slightly trick question, is that predominantly the most successful at delivering change, particularly at scale, is a combination of mobilizing and organizing. Okay, the ability to simultaneously focus on developing our people and creating those moments in time through urgency, the moment when we have to act and act together. And it's that combination of success, building my individual capacity, building us as a community, and achieving our goal as an urgent call to arms, which is the most effective at driving activist change. So in the last couple of minutes, I promised you some very practical tips on how to take the leap, to summon your own courage to get started on this. And it might be that you're sat there with an idea, no matter how big or small, that you're thinking of something that you could change that would make the world a better place. Well, this is the time to reflect on how you do that. The first one is this, and I love this phrase from Jane Addams on International Women's Day, one of the finest activists in the history of the United States. And Jane Addams said, "Beware the snare of preparation." And in community organizing, we say that action is to organizing what oxygen is to the body, so that through action we feed the body like we feed it with oxygen. So get to action quickly, even if small, because we cannot begin to learn what to do effectively until we start to act. The second one, and this is Kate Granger teaching us this, frame the issues very simply in ways that are designed to engage people's imagination and their energy. Third practical tip that we can put into our work immediately is to weave what I've called relational conversations into everyday work. And this comes from the teaching of a community organizer called Michael Geekan. And he said, you know, the thing we have to understand is that all real life, all real work happens by us meeting, not through meetings. All real life is meeting, not meetings. And if we can apply that in even small interactions with each other, then we'll be moving towards a movement approach. Fourth one is connect with your first follower or become one to someone who inspires you, you know, and that's really quite a radical way of thinking about leadership. And I think if we can begin to show that form of leadership and begin to value it more, then we'll bring about changes in public service, which will have a significant effect. And the fifth one is this, you know, as much as we can, always be thinking about how we make ourselves redundant. You know, the organizer will tell you that that's her ultimate aim, because we know that it can only be a movement if it moves without me. So the campaigns and projects that I'm most proud of that I started in my work in the last 10 years are the ones that are still going now, because they've won their aims, but they've pushed on through and found new aims and new causes that they want to fight for. So if you're interested in learning more about this and you want to go online and see examples, I've put here, you know, 5 of my favorites: personalized health budgets, pimping the Zimmers, as Helen told us about in module 2, fighting for the rights of parents of premature children, fighting for maternal rights and patient experience to be improved, and looking at the use of technology in healthcare and how we get the products we need rather than the products that companies want to sell us. All of this is about how we move from the world as it is to the world as it should be. And the question I think we can sit with, whether we're joining in groups or individually, is what is it about the world as it is that I see as wrong, where I can see a way forward? And what is the world that I want to create for the future? You know, Rebecca Solnit said that when we talk of social change, we talk of movements. And it's a word that suggests vast groups of people walking together, leaving behind one way and traveling towards another. And it brings me to the last point, which is so critical to movement building and is so critical to sustaining our energy to do this work. And it's hope. You know, that if we have hope and if we can impart hope, then there's very little that we can't achieve. You know, Dov Seidman, who's an American author, wrote this. He said, in his experience, the last era of management was about how much performance we could extract from people. Well, what if the next may be about how much humanity we can inspire? So that brings us towards the end of module 4. What I want to do is to let you know something very exciting, which I know hundreds of you have been using, the learning management system, which has all sorts of tools and resources for you to access to improve and enhance your learning. We've just launched the latest module, so there's a whole raft of materials up on resilience, resistance, reactance, and towards the end of next week, we'll be launching the final module, which is all about social movement approaches and public narrative. So I do hope that you're making good use of it. Please send an email to the email address you can see on the screen if you want to gain access. We also still have, despite next week being the last main module, a whole offer of short sessions where you can go and have conversations with each other about different themes. So we've got the wonderful Hilary Garrett leading a session on change on the front line this week. For those who are joining us from the University of Central Lancashire, you lucky people, you have your own special session, which will include stories from many of your senior leadership on resilience, and that's on Wednesday. Kate and Zoe, two of my colleagues, will be talking about how we make change under pressure. So they'll be bringing a clinical perspective and an improvement perspective to that. And then finally, we'll be launching the Digital School for Change Agents with a special session with our very own Dominic Cushnan. And that's on Wednesday in a week's time. So next week, it's back over to Helen to close the school for 2018 with our 5th module. And this will be looking at change in the future. What is it that we need as a change agent? And how do we need to think in order to lead for future challenges? So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined today. Please do leave any passing comments or thoughts in the chat box. And I will see you next Thursday. Bye.